Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in your part of the world. I hope you're having a great day, and thank you for joining us. If this is your first time joining one of our webinars, thank you for joining us. I hope you like what you see. Hope we give you some valuable information. And if you are returning, welcome back. So this is actually the second part of a webinar. Uditha presented a webinar last month, and it had so many questions that we not only ran far over the time, but there were still a number of questions remaining. So he very generously volunteered to come back and answer those questions plus more. So before I hand over to him, I will give you a quick little introduction to the ICCP for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Okay, just let me share my screen. Okay, so who is the ICCP and what do we do? The Institute of Construction Claims Practitioners is a professional members organization that recognizes those with the skills, qualifications, and expertise in the professional management of construction claims. We have three primary objectives, which are to establish international professional standards in claims, to give recognition to those who have gained the skills and knowledge needed to appropriately handle claims, and help educate those who would like to develop those skills. And why is there a need for the ICCP when there are so many construction organizations? Well, quite simply, construction claims have become a key part of the international construction industry, and claims practitioners come from many construction backgrounds, from quantity surveying and engineering to project management to construction law, and so on. And until the ICCP, there has been no institute that directly recognizes those who have that specialist knowledge, experience, and skills in the management, preparation, and response to claims. Okay, so I will quickly introduce that we have an elected steering committee of 3 fellows and an elected president. Andy Hewitt is our executive officer, and Nina is our general manager. She is currently on maternity leave, so I am filling in for her at the moment. Okay, in terms of membership, I won't go into the specifics of each. I will simply say that we have 3 levels of regular individual membership. Each has their own criteria. We have 2 special levels of membership for students studying for their first qualification, and they can then graduate into graduate membership. And we also have corporate membership for consultancies, companies, etc., that either are wholly or in part dedicated to claims. And yeah, if you would like to know more about any of those, please let me know. And I'll just dive quickly into some member benefits. We have a members area of our website, which has a collection of white papers, case studies, etc., for our body of knowledge. We have collected further education and training opportunities around the world and the internet. We have a bookshop which doesn't actually sell books, but does review the latest industry releases. We have a growing library of templates to help our members not only save time, but also ensure that their claims are completed to the highest standards. We hold regular CPD webinars like this one. Many of them are open to the public. However, only members will get a CPD certificate. We have the ICCP Academy, which are more technical CPD opportunities, which are only for members. We offer discounts on books from Wiley Blackwell and Rutledge, as well as through our training partner Claims Class. Members get a monthly newsletter, which keeps them up to date on the latest in the industry. We offer industry and exposure in the form of a public listing of members. Members also, of course, receive logos and certificates. We have a private LinkedIn group where members can discuss their contracts and claims questions and get the feedback of the fellows in the organization. And we have the optional benefit of the Register of Claims Practitioners, which is popular among our consultant members. That is a good way for them to increase their online exposure. Okay, I know that was very quick. If you requested further information when you register for this webinar, I will be sending you some more information. And if you did not ask for more, but now you would like to know more, please visit our website, instituteccp.com, or email me, jennifer.smith@instituteccp.com. And one last thing before I hand it over to Uditha is that on the 20th of September, we will have our first conference. It will be a half-day conference over Zoom, Construction Claims and Dispute Avoidance, How to Achieve Successful Outcomes. And that event will be free for members. Any members watching this, if you have not emailed me to register, please do so, and I will add you to the list. For non-members, please visit our website. You have sadly missed the early bird period, but I think it is still a bargain at £60 for a half a day of presentations by industry experts. And with that, I will hand it over to today's speaker, another industry expert, Uditha Tharanga.
Thanks, Jennifer. I will share my screen then. Okay. I've received some questions before from few of the participants last time, and I tried to answer them as much as possible. And on those questions, I'm not sure whether everyone has received it or not, but I have included it in the presentation to discuss. So the first question I have is that what are the risks and timing when making a claim on the bonds, both performance security and advance payment guarantee? The thing is actually, in most cases, the terms of the bond and the securities or any other instrument will dictate what are the occasions claim can be made. For example, if it is any default or any breach of the contractor, so it's usually clearly mentioned, non-performing of obligation, delays and default. And most of the time, these instruments are independent from the contract, but in some cases, through the wording of the contract, like a contractor, main contract, and default, if it is defined under the contract, or non-performance, it is defined under the contract, are linked to the obligations or liabilities under the contract. So, well, in that case, yes, there will be risks and claims of making a demand or claim under these instruments. Like one example is this ICC Uniform Rules of Demand Guarantees, or these 758, which governs the bonds, which defines what are the compliance demand under the bond, what are the who's the beneficiary, what are the occasions a claim can be accepted by the guarantor. So those things are defined. But if it is linked to contract, usually the contract does not specify what occasion the claims can be made, but instead the contract adopt the approach of asking the other party to indemnify the innocent party for a premature or a falsified or a fraud claim under these instruments. Like sometimes the contract specify the occasions, in case of dispute and the award is given, the other party is not complied, or there is a defect, or there is a termination like that, and the contract says, such like in credit 2017, the other party should indemnify the innocent party if the claim is made for any reason, not of any reason out of these circumstances. So likewise, yes, there are risks and the thing, but most importantly, uh, well, sometimes the parties can rush to make claims under these bonds due to sheer misinterpretation of the wording of the bond, or like without being aware that these bonds are linked to the contract in some way, and like these are the things that one should be aware. Well, apart from that, like you need to see whether the circumstances warrant a claim, whether you do have enough merit to make a claim. Because once you make a claim and the bank can cash these instruments, like it's in one go. I mean, it's possible that you damage the business relationship, and it's possible the other party won't take an injunction as well. So yes, this is about the risk and timing. Regarding the timing, like I should say, you should wait until you have clear evidence of a default or whatever the circumstances that tries to instruments.
I'm sorry, Udita. We've had someone ask if you could speak a little bit louder, please. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello. Now they can hear. You can hear. I'm audible enough. Hi, Jennifer. I'm audible enough.
If I can hear you, if somebody could put into the chat if that was better.
The thing is, like the next question is about like about suspension claims. If the claims under suspension are barred until 120 days have passed, on what grounds can the contractor claim for remedies? Well, I presume that no claims of suspension should be made until the 120 days have passed from the beginning of the suspension. That's I assume that's what you mean. If that is the case, well, the contract do usually provide remedies. Like sometimes, if the suspension is exercised in bad faith, for instance, like if there is such term in the contract where your claims are barred until 120 days, there is a high possibility the other party may use it in bad faith. Well, if your contract is under the jurisdiction where the good faith is implied, yes, in that case, you have a remedy under the breach of this faith obligation. Or if there is a negligence from the other party, so you can divert just the contractual mechanism and ask for remedy. So that's the other thing. But however, whether you do have like entitlement or any other remedy, just the relevant clause has to be met. But sometimes it's possible that these remedies are limited to the occasions where the suspension is not caused by the, for instance, payment delays. If the other party is delaying the payment and the contractor is suspending the work, so that will, in principle, not be a reasonable circumstances for to use the clause against. Yeah. So that's it, and then we move to the other question. The other question is about, aside from impossibility and frustration, is it widely accepted principle that if a contract becomes highly impracticable, that it is rendered commercially unviable? The principle of impervision comes to mind. Well, yes, the principle of impervision is still applies. I think it's from the French law, French civil code. But there are differences, like the doctrine of frustration is basically related to, physical or legal and practical impossibility, or the occasions where the contract has become radically different from what the parties have initially agreed. For example, if the contractor is building a train track and there is a huge landslide, now the contractor has in order to proceed with the work, he has no other option than to build a bridge, which was not originally in his scope. So such things could easily frustrate the contract. So this is a frustration. But impervision is something something set the bar of the impracticability and impossibility less higher. Like it's basically if there is an unforeseen event occur, like after formation of the contract, and which becomes the perform which makes the performance excessively difficult or burdensome, then the parties have the ability, or which is also an unforeseen, then the parties have the freedom to terminate or renegotiate. I mean, having to have it renegotiated implies that the subsequent work of the contract is possible. So it like sometimes it's less stringent. Also, like it gives the parties the freedom to to enter into fresh contract. Like difficult is like the force majeure and frustration involves the event beyond the party's control, and whereas the impermission focus on an unforeseen event, which is very difficult for the party to perform the obligation, and where now they have option to negotiate. So that's the key difference. So it's not necessarily the same. So these are two different things. But there are events that qualify for both. For instance, what the train track example, which I explained to you about, it qualifies both. But there are some cases which qualify the frustration, which does not qualify does not fall under the doctrine of the provision. But the other important thing is in mostly the civil law jurisdictions, the judges or the arbitrators, they have the discretion to define what events qualify under the doctrine. So this is what you want to do. And moving on to our next question, is the contractor liable for varied extra work done on the third party as those are away from these responsibilities? I assume this is regarding termination and after termination.
Question 4. Okay, I assume this is after termination, and this is, see, there are two aspects of this question. One thing is, are you talking about the physical liability of the physical works, or are you talking about the liability of financial liability? Is two different things. Regarding the physical liability, the contractor is not liable for any extra work, I mean, done by a third party. But regarding the financial liability, again, there are two aspects. If the varied works or extra work is necessary because of the default or defective work of the earlier contractor, then he's liable for the cost fully. But if it is not due to default of the previous contractor, then there is a mechanism to deal with this sort of cost. Usually, like we add the new contractor's cost and then we deduct the previous contractor's cost, some sort of thing. So, yeah. Well, it is not only the employer who has the right to terminate the contract under different reasons. The contractor also has the right to do so. Yes, employee is in default. In my experience, it is when the employee delays or withhold the payment indefinitely. In such case, until when should the contractor continue to be present at the job and not suspend the works? Well, usually the contract defines the grace period or notices period in case of non-payment or withholding of the payment. And the right to terminate depends on the circumstances. And simply speaking, I mean, simple, like, the occasional payment delay would not be sufficient to terminate or the contract. But if this payment is due to substantial incapacity, financial incapacity, or serious breach, like, or they have like, they have shown the intention not to pay. This should warrant enough circumstance to terminate the contract. I mean, well, the contractor should wait until the default becomes substantial to take some such drastic action. The good strategy would be to provoke the employer to get in writing his payment delays and make it as an anticipatory breach. I mean, and it makes your case stronger. So this is something I would suggest. And then regarding next question, If the contractor recommend the work after his termination, his self-termination on the employer's default, can the termination period be accounted for liquidated damages? I think I've explained this question because there are certain aspects of this question that have to be clarified, and why termination is required when there is a right to suspend, and whether the contractor is behind the schedule at the time of termination, or has the work reached the practical completion, well, was the termination lawful or like so. But remember, the termination is one-way remedy, and one is notified, like the contractor is deemed to have considered terminated. Well, if the one who raised the question is present in the session, he can clarify it, but we will leave it to the end.
I emailed that person and they did not respond, and I don't see their name in the attendee list.
Oh, no worries then. No
Yeah.
worries. How can an employer prove anticipatory breach? For example, if in anticipation that the contractor will not complete the works on time, can the employer terminate the contract? How can the employer prove that contractor won't be able to deploy mitigation measures? That's a good question. Yes, but yes, anticipatory breach in principle will entitle the other party to terminate, like not to perform, but it has to be measured in the objective conduct of the parties. Well, and there is another aspect of this question, is that like not proceeding works with the due expedition is also a breach of the contract. And I presume there will be number of notices regarding this, letters and correspondence, and then the asking whether the other party can mitigate or not. But like then this may qualify the circumstances of termination. But if the contractor agreed to now give you a recovery plan, let's saying, okay, I'm going to recover these delays in the next 2 months, and then this will become a problem, because it will it will defy your case of anticipatory breach, because he's showing now the anticipation of performing and mitigating. But the thing is, like in that case, you have to see whether the delays are such that it can be recoverable, or is it delayed beyond to the extent that is they are irreparable, or the time for completion cannot be achieved whatever the mitigation measures are in place. So this you have to bear in mind. Well, regarding question number 8, can loss of profit for suspension of the contract be claimed? If it is due to breach of contract, then yes, profit is recoverable. But however, if the claimable heads, or if the contract says that it's only the cost can be claimed in case of suspension, but then it is only the cost, or then it's only cost, you have to follow the contract. Question number 9, what damages will the employee recover during termination for anticipatory breach? It is similar to any breach of contract. It is similar damages in the case of termination for default of the other parties. It's the balance amount and all expenses incurred, balance amount of contract of the replacement contractor, or all expenses incurred in completing the outstanding work, less the amount of the contract price unremained or unpaid to the previous contractor. So this is the measure of damages. Usually all the expenses due to termination are recoverable. And then question number 10 is, contractor's progress has been slow, creating doubts about the completion of the works as initially planned. Employee is entitled to terminate based on the contract conditions, and they intended to do so. It is well known that in such scenario, the employee can recover their cost. However, may they also impose penalty in addition to damages. Well, if the contract is terminated pursuant to a contractual power, and that is given in the contract, and the claimable heads are also included in the contract, and that include penalty, which is, like, also when I say a penalties, like sometimes the common law, the people, those who are working under common law jurisdiction will raise a question. But let's say if there is an amount, I will avoid the word penalty. If there is a pre-agreed amount that says in case of termination, one party has to pay to the other party, yes, that can be recoverable. But the penalties in the sense, like if you're putting an amount that is, like this extravagant, or like it's a huge amount compared to a maximum legitimate commercial interest that you're trying to protect. Well, recovering that will become difficult. I mean, enforceability of such penalty will be a different question. But if the contract provide a pre-agreed amount to be recovered in case of termination, yes. And if you opt for a common law claim, or like the extra contractual claim, or if you claim for actual losses and expenses, and this would prevent your ability to recover what is in the contract as pre-agreed amount. And then there's another question: what will happen if, then when you terminate the previous contractor, he's already in delay, and then you bring another contractor to proceed with the works, and now this duration exceeds the original time for completion. Well, in that case, if subjected to how it is written in the contract, like the LDs are also recoverable. Uh, how can a client recover? Next question is question number 11. How can the client recover or claim loss and expenses in the case of termination of the contract? Well, depend on the case of course of termination and how the claims are brought forward. In general, like in case of contractors defaults, employees, owners, extra cost of completing the works, is extended overheads and cost, loss of use, and loss of profit and liquidated damages, they're all recoverable. But depends on whether you are like making a claim under the contract, or you're making claim as a general damages or losses and expenses. Should all construction contract contain provision on liquidated damages? Yes, since the courts do not entertain them with penalties. Won't a claim for general and special damages made to the court be more beneficial? No, not necessarily, because like proving the real damages, actual damages will be a daunting task. It will be very difficult, I would say so. Yeah, but people like me, I would get some extra jobs for sure. I'll get some extra time, but the thing is, it is not recommended if you are entering into contract, because if there is a pre-agreed sum in the contract, it is easy to recover. But bear in mind that, like when you talk about the penalties and liquidated damages, I think in 2016 the Supreme Court of UK, they revised the rule of liquidated damages penalties. Means, like earlier we were in the people were in the understanding that liquidated damages is a genuine pre-estimate of estimated loss in case of delay. But the court clarifies that the pre-agreed sum is not a genuine pre-estimate, is not necessarily make it a penalty. The court says what makes a pre-agreed amount a penalty is that it should exceed, or it should be an extravagant or unconscionable amount to what the employer will incur, or his maximum legitimate commercial interest. Because it will, because of that, it is still possible for you to put a relatively high amount to discourage or to deter the other party from breaching the contract or delaying the works. So it does not necessarily make it a penalty. So in that case, I suggest that it is best to agree. Plus, if you see in like under French civil law or UAE civil law, civil code, civil law countries in most cases will give an opportunity for parties to I mean, revise these estimates if it appears at the time of this action that the amounts are high or too low to recover the, expenses and losses. So the simple answer, yes, it's recommended. Please agree. It is best to agree because proving actual damages is very difficult, especially for the employers and even for the contractors. I mean, when it comes to his the unabsorbed cost and the loss of profit and loss of bonding capacity, and these things are like theoretically looks good, but when when you try to prove them, it's very difficult. And next question, how is termination disadvantageous or not advisable as a recourse on the side of employer versus the benefit of an irresponsible and faulting contractor being replaced? Well, how is termination disadvantage? Simple answer is when you do not have sufficient merits to make a termination under the contract. When the employer has not sufficiently acquired his right to make a termination, well, then he will be eventually accused for wrongful termination, which is per se is like a repudiation of contract. And then like you are in like never-ending dispute and court proceedings cycles. That's the thing. So that's why it's always best to hire someone and see whether you have enough merit for your case and whether you can terminate the contract. Well, in that case, yes, that's the recommended strategy. And the benefits of terminating a defaulted contractor is inevitably the speeding up the work and like with the replacement contractor, and the damages are recoverable. And the only downside is like your time for completion in most cases will be expended. But the thing is, if the economic conditions are more favorable than at the time of signing the contract, well, then you will get lesser price to complete the balance work, and you don't have to pay this remaining balance to the contractor, because no one can gain anything from their own breach or default. So those are in brief the benefits. Okay, so are there any more questions?
Yes, we just have a few. The first question from Sammy asks, how will the cost implications of termination be borne?
How will cost implication of termination be borne? It's depend on the reason for termination. For example, like if you are working for the contractor, termination for default will be like the worst thing that can happen, because the employer doesn't need, he can withhold your existing payments, and he doesn't have to pay you anything, and he can wait until he appointed his contractor, and then like can then and achieve the balance work, and and then settle all the accounts with the replacement contractor. If there's anything balance, he can recover. So this is the impact on the contractor. But if it is for the employer, basically the employer's default, then the contractor have to show that he could not find the replacement work, and he terminated the contract. His staff and like all his resources are now unabsorbed, and he could not generate the revenue as expected, and these damages are recoverable, like from the contractors. And well, if it is the other case, like we can discuss it vice versa. Yeah, it usually depends on the cause of termination. And for the frustration, for instance, we consider the like the loss lies where it falls. Like we consider none of the parties are at default, so we try to settle the accounts with all expenses, trying to make a fair bargain, and ensure that none of the parties get more, because none is at default. I hope that explanation is sufficient. The question is like it's broad.
Very broad, yes, but
Yeah.
thank you. Okay, the next question from Mohammed. The client can terminate the contract based on the price variation, meaning if the vendor asks more in the lump sum contract due to some changes, and the client ascertains that it's overclaimed, not fully justified.
Well, let me
That's-
digest the question a bit. Client can terminate the contract based on the price variation. The vendor asks more in lump sum contract due to some changes, and not necessarily. If there is a termination due to variation, it is because the variation vitiate the contract, and it. Like in USA, for instance, we call it a cardinal change. Like that the change does not reflect the scope of the contractor, the scope of the work, and how it goes beyond and the amount wise and the scope wise to the contractor. I mean, you can't just ask to build a bridge from the contractor who's contracting with you to make a building. So that sort of variation would indeed vitiate the contract. So, well, in that case, it warrants the termination. But if the vendor is asking simply more money and for changes, and then you have the option to go for other vendors, and then I don't see there is a justifiable reason as to why the client should terminate the contract. So see
sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you. The next question, I think this goes back to question 13, the second to final question. He asks if you were referring to the Cavendish case.
Well, I did my studies long ago, but I don't exactly remember the case names. But it's in 2016 they revised these rules with the maximum number of judges in Supreme Court. But if the Cavendish case is much older than that, I think. No. This is related to the parking issue, the parking ticket issue. I think, yes, I think this is the case. This is one of the cases. There are one or two cases that they combine and issue this the ratio. Issue this decision as a ratio. So I think this is one of the cases. True. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And he also asks, in a recent case of the Buckingham Group construction, there is a decision that there should not be a cap on liability. Would you advise how such a decision has been reached and why?
Well, I am yet to I've seen the case, but I'm yet to study all the decision and the pleadings of the parties and everything. But in a recent case of Buckingham Group construction, there is a decision that there should not be a cap on liability. Would you advise how such a decision has been reached and why? Okay, I will give you my opinion. Well, the thing is, there are two aspects. I think there is a freedom to contract principle. I mean, the parties are at their discretion to agree on a cap. I mean, considering with their relative bargaining power. For example, if I'm negotiating a contract with someone with a similar bargaining power, and both of us together come to a conclusion that this will be a cap on liability. I mean, there shouldn't be a reason why it should not warrant to be agreed like that. But there is another aspect of this because, for example, if I'm the prime contractor and I'm negotiating with the subcontractor, and the subcontractor usually, it's very natural that they're asking a cap on the liability just to secure because their cash flows and the financial credentials are very less than the prime contractor. But that should not give an opportunity to that subcontractor to perform in a very negligence or in a very inconsistent way to accumulate damages and cause more damages on the contractor, because he would delay the project, let's say, for 100 days, and he can reach his cap where the main contractor or the prime contractor is still penalized under the main contract with the employer for a substantial amounts. So in that case, it would raise the question, yes, the cap should be applicable, and and then depends on the circumstances. So Well, in general, I cannot tell you like the liability of the caps are not suggested. Like it should be carefully evaluated, and depending on the circumstances, it could seem reasonable, and in some cases not. And consider where you have a nominated subcontractor now is negotiating with you for a cap of liability, and on top of that, the employee is suggesting you to client or the owner is suggesting you to agree for a cap, and that leaves the prime contractor is in a very awkward position. And in that case, yes, I said like I wish there had been a rule that like nullify any cap on liability. And this goes back to my previous answer of the civil law jurisdictions, where like for example, Article 390 of UAE Civil Code says the party can agree for a cap, but if it proves if it convinced to the judge that these actual damages far exceeds the cap, and then yes, the cap would not be applicable. So yeah, this is my opinion.
All right, thank you. And the only remaining question we have in the box is, when the economic balance of the contract is broken due to scope changes issued by the client, can the contractor terminate the contract?
Oh, well, as I said, if these changes far exceed to what the contractor has agreed to perform, yes, in that case, it would jeopardize the economic balance of the contract and the fairness of the contract. Well, yes, it may enable the contractor to terminate under the contract. For example, well, some cases like the scope changes, when you say like there are a number of type of scope changes, like it can be like a differing site condition, or it can be like the instructed scope change, the constructive change, something like that. But when I say in most of the cases, these instructed scope changes will usually 30-40% more than what the contractor has initially agreed, and that would that may in principle enable the contractor to terminate the contract. So there are a few aspects to this. I think the amount wise, you have to check whether the contract far exceeds the amounts that has been agreed under the contract, and the scope that is included in this variation order, the change order, is not matching the contractor's competence. Or, for example, the other example is when the prime contractor agreed to build something, the client might come up with something, some change order requesting contractor to do a design, and the contractor doesn't have like now the as the contractor who execute the work, he doesn't have the capacity or competency to do a design. Well, in that case also, yeah, it warrants if the client so insists, it wants to go back on the contract, or like consider that the contract has been terminated. Consider that the contract has been terminated.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was our final question. So thank you again, Uditha, for coming back and doing this follow-up session. And thank you to everyone for attending. I do apologize that we did have some technical issues at the beginning, but we worked them all out. So I hope this was a valuable and informative session for you. And anything else you'd like to say, Uditha?
No, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. And I hope I've answered the questions in the way they have expected.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And our next event will be our conference in September. So I do hope to see all of you there. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.